Every great love story begins with something simple: a glance, a smile, an unexpected connection. However, what truly determines the course of this story goes far beyond those initial moments. The way you manage that initial connection can transform it into something fleeting or into a genuine obsession. And that's what we're going to discuss today, from the perspective of Stoicism. Not to manipulate destructively, but to understand the emotional mechanisms that govern us. There is a thin line between persuasion and manipulation. When we talk about persuasion, we're referring to the art of convincing someone ethically, presenting solid arguments that lead the person to make a conscious decision. Manipulation, on the other hand, seeks to create an emotional addiction, where the target begins to crave your presence and attention in an almost irrational manner. It's like the difference between offering someone water when they're thirsty and deliberately creating that thirst to then offer the water. Science has already proven that the human brain can become addicted to intense emotions, whether positive or negative. Think of gambling. People spend fortunes seeking that dopamine rush that comes with each win. The curious thing is that even losses keep this cycle active, creating a state of tension and hope that fuels the addiction. Our brains don't necessarily distinguish between what makes us feel good and what just strongly stimulates us. In a study conducted by Stanford University, researchers discovered that the brain responds very similarly when receiving a message from a loved one and when consuming addictive substances. The same neural circuits are activated, creating behavioral patterns identical to those observed in chemical dependence. This explains why often intelligent and rational people end up trapped in clearly harmful relationships. It's not a matter of intelligence, but of brain biochemistry. Stoicism, a philosophy developed in ancient Greece, teaches us that true happiness lies in emotional balance. For the Stoics, extreme emotions, both euphoria and despair, are equally harmful because they distance us from rationality. In this context, creating an obsession in someone is, paradoxically, creating an imbalance that can be destructive for both parties involved. Consider how this applies to modern relationships. When you meet someone who maintains a constant emotional state, without significant highs or lows, how do you feel? Probably comfortable, but not necessarily stimulated. Now think of someone who takes you from moments of ecstasy to periods of uncertainty. This emotional roller coaster creates a constant state of alertness, keeping your brain focused on that person in an almost obsessive manner. This is exactly the mechanism some people use to create emotional dependency, alternating between moments of extreme affection and periods of indifference generates emotional peaks that lead the brain to crave that positive feeling more and more, even if it means enduring negative moments. It's like a gambler enduring several consecutive losses in the hope of a single big win. A classic example is the man who, after a wonderful date, simply disappears for a few days. The woman, who experienced intense emotions during the date, begins to think about him constantly, trying to understand what happened. When he finally returns, the sense of relief is so great that it creates a powerful neurological association. This cycle, repeated a few times, can transform a casual interest into real emotional dependency. However, it is crucial to understand that these techniques, although effective in the short term, tend to create unstable and toxic relationships. I remember a friend who constantly applied these methods. In the beginning, he had women completely passionate about him, but over time, these relationships deteriorated, turning into cycles of fights, dramatic reconciliations, and eventually traumatic breakups. Today, years later, he confesses that these relationships left deep emotional scars on him as well. The Stoics teach us that we should not seek to control others, but ourselves. Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest Stoic philosophers, said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." When we try to manipulate others' emotions, we lose control over our own emotions, becoming dependent on that toxic cycle as well. From a neurological perspective, creating an obsession in someone means constantly stimulating their brain's reward system. This system, responsible for the feeling of pleasure, is activated when we alternate between giving attention and ignoring the person. The inconsistency creates a neurological response called intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism used in slot machines to keep players gambling. In experiments with rats, scientists found that when the reward, food, was given predictably, the animals responded calmly and controlled. However, when the reward was unpredictable, the rats showed signs of anxiety and obsession, even ignoring their basic needs to stay close to the potential reward source. The same happens with us. Predictability brings comfort, but unpredictability creates obsession. A study from Harvard University showed that relationships where one partner is emotionally inconsistent have a 70% higher chance of developing patterns of emotional dependence. The most surprising thing is that this dependence affects not only the manipulated person but also the manipulator, creating a cycle where both are trapped in an unhealthy dynamic. This explains why so many men who use manipulation techniques end up, ironically, becoming obsessive about the women they manage to conquer in this way. The feeling of control over others' emotions is, in itself, addictive. It's like a game, where, upon winning, you become even more determined to keep playing. Let's analyze some specific techniques that create this emotional dependency and understand why they work in the short term but fail miserably over time. The first is what psychologists call bombardment love, followed by distancing. You show intense interest initially, constant messages, frequent compliments, total attention. This creates an expectation and a pattern. When you suddenly distance yourself, the absence of these stimuli generates a feeling of loss and anxiety that makes the person think about you constantly. A second technique is selective validation. You praise and value only certain behaviors, ignoring or even criticizing others. This creates conditioning where the person begins to modify their behavior to gain your approval, becoming increasingly dependent on that external validation. The third involves creating mystery and unpredictability. You share personal information slowly and deliberately, always maintaining an air of mystery. This makes the person constantly try to solve the puzzle that you represent, keeping them mentally engaged even when you're not present. A client I once worked with frequently used these techniques. He told me about a woman he had met at a social event. In the first few days, he was extremely present. Long phone calls, constant messages, memorable dates. After 2 weeks, he suddenly started taking hours to respond to messages and canceled 2 consecutive dates. When they finally met again, she was visibly anxious and much more emotionally invested than before. "It worked perfectly," he said to me with a smile. 3 months later, he returned to my office, but this time without a smile. The relationship had become an emotional battlefield. She oscillated between moments of extreme dependency and episodes of distrust and insecurity. He, for his part, was exhausted from maintaining the facade of unpredictability and had, ironically, developed a constant fear of losing her. This case perfectly illustrates what the Stoics warn us about. When we manipulate emotions, we lose our own tranquility. Epictetus, another great Stoic philosopher, said, "He who wishes to secure the good of others has already secured his own." Emotional manipulation is exactly that. Stirring someone else's cup, hoping yours remains calm, an impractical impossibility. For Stoicism, the true connection between two people should not be based on dependency, but on conscious choice. When you create a bond based on manipulation, you're building on quicksand. Over time, the structure inevitably sinks. Research in relationship psychology shows that couples who report greater long-term satisfaction are those who maintain clear and consistent communication. Emotional predictability, far from being boring, creates a safe space where genuine love can flourish. Mystery and unpredictability may be exciting initially, but they rarely sustain a healthy relationship for long. There is a crucial difference between sparking genuine interest and creating obsession. Genuine interest arises when you present yourself authentically, sharing your values and allowing the other person to truly get to know you. Obsession, on the other hand, arises from manipulation and control, creating an idealized image that inevitably falls apart over time. I remember observing 2 types of men in my life. The first type was a specialist in conquest techniques. He knew exactly when to call, when to distance himself, which emotional buttons to press. He had immediate success, winning women quickly. The second type was authentic, unconsciously inconsistent, sometimes awkward, but always genuine in his intentions and expressions. The first accumulated intense but brief relationships. The second took longer to establish connections, but when he did, they lasted and grew over time. An experiment conducted at the University of Toronto followed 100 couples over 5 years. Initially, couples where one partner used emotional manipulation techniques reported greater emotional intensity and satisfaction. However, after 3 years, 78% of those relationships had ended, compared to only 32% of relationships based on authenticity and consistent communication. Neuroscience helps us understand this phenomenon. Relationships based on manipulation primarily activate the brain's reward system, associated with intense but fleeting pleasures. Authentic relationships also activate the oxytocin system, associated with lasting bonds and a sense of security. It's the difference between a sugar spike and a complete nutritious meal. Stoicism, in its millennia-old wisdom, already understood this distinction. Seneca, another great name in this philosophy, stated, "No one can wear a mask for long. Falseness soon gives way to truth." When you create an obsession through manipulative techniques, you're essentially putting on a mask that will eventually fall off. This doesn't mean you should be completely passive in your relationships. On the contrary, Stoicism encourages deliberate and conscious action. The central question is the intention behind your actions. Are you acting to build something genuine, or just to satisfy your ego and need for control? Let's examine a healthier approach, inspired by Stoic principles. Instead of creating emotional peaks through manipulation, focus on building a consistent presence that adds real value to the person's life. Be unpredictable not by strategy, but by authenticity. Surprise them not by calculation, but by natural creativity. A client implemented this change in his love life with surprising results. Instead of using the distancing technique to generate anxiety, he began to be consistent in his communication, but unpredictable in his actions, planning creative dates, sharing deep thoughts, demonstrating genuine vulnerability. The result was a much deeper and mutually satisfying connection than any he had experienced using manipulative techniques. "For the first time, I feel I can be myself and still be desired," he told me. "It's liberating not to have to calculate every move as if I were playing chess." This is the true lesson Stoicism offers for relationships. Authenticity not only frees the other person from manipulation, but also frees you from the exhausting task of maintaining facades and strategies. As Marcus Aurelius said, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." Paraphrasing, the best connection is not to treat the loved one as a goal to be conquered, but as a human being to be known and appreciated. Research in positive psychology demonstrates that relationships where both partners practice genuine self-disclosure, sharing fears, hopes, values, and vulnerabilities, tend to develop deeper levels of intimacy and long-term satisfaction. This self-disclosure creates a bond based on real knowledge, not projections or fantasies. However, there is a reason why emotional manipulation techniques are so popular. They work in the short term. When you alternate between giving attention and distancing yourself, you create an intermittent reinforcement pattern that is extremely effective in generating attachment. The problem is that this attachment comes with anxiety, insecurity, and eventually resentment. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology analyzed attachment patterns in romantic relationships. Researchers found that individuals subjected to intermittent reinforcement patterns developed anxious attachment, characterized by fear of abandonment and a constant need for reassurance. This type of attachment, although intense, is associated with higher levels of psychological suffering and relational instability. In practice, this means that manipulating emotions to create obsession inevitably leads to a relationship where both parties suffer. The manipulated person develops anxious attachment patterns, while the manipulator becomes a prisoner of their own strategy, unable to relax and be authentic. Notice how this contrasts with the Stoic view of relationships. For the Stoics, The I goal is not to control the other, but to develop virtue and inner tranquility, regardless of external circumstances. When you deliberately seek to create obsession in someone, you're essentially tying your tranquility to that person's behavior, the opposite of what Stoicism recommends. Epictetus teaches, don't seek for events to happen as you wish, but wish for them to happen as they do, and your life will go smoothly. Applied to relationships, this means accepting the other person as they are, not trying to mold them to satisfy your emotional needs or validate your ego. It's important to emphasize that there are ethical and healthy ways to spark and maintain romantic interest. Studies in evolutionary psychology show that certain qualities naturally attract and maintain interest: demonstrable competence in valued areas, empathetic communication skills, consistency between words and actions, and the demonstration of qualities like loyalty and reliability. The fundamental difference lies in intention and authenticity. When you genuinely develop these qualities, not as tactics for manipulation, but as an authentic expression of your character, the interest you spark tends to be healthier and more sustainable. It's not an obsession based on insecurity, but an attraction based on real admiration. An experiment conducted by psychologists at the University of California asked participants to interact with potential romantic partners under two conditions. In the first, they were to follow predefined strategies to create attraction. In the second, they were to be authentic and present. The results showed that although calculated strategies generated greater initial attraction, authentic interactions led to a higher desire to continue getting to know the person and higher levels of perceived compatibility. This brings us back to Stoic wisdom. True value lies not in external techniques, but in cultivating a virtuous character. As Seneca said, "If you want to be loved, love." There is no more powerful strategy for creating genuine connection than developing the ability to see, appreciate, and value the other person in their entirety. Perhaps you're thinking, but what about the challenge? Isn't it true that people appreciate more what they earn with difficulty? There is merit in that thought, but there is a crucial difference between being an authentic challenge and creating artificial difficulties. Being an authentic challenge means having high standards, clear values, and a sense of purpose that transcends any relationship. You are not available all the time because you have a rich and meaningful life. You don't accept less than you deserve because you have solid self-esteem. This naturally creates a healthy type of challenge that attracts people who truly value who you are. Creating artificial difficulties, on the other hand, involves emotional games and calculated manipulation. It's pretending to be uninterested. When you are interested, deliberately creating jealousy, or alternating between extreme availability and complete disappearance without a real reason. These behaviors can create obsession, but also instability and suffering. A client I was treating was a master of these artificial tactics. He timed his message responses, calculated how many days to wait before contacting after a date, and deliberately mentioned other women to create jealousy. It worked like clockwork. Women became obsessed with him, but he came to therapy week after week, feeling empty and unable to form genuine connections. They're not in love with me, he finally realized. They're addicted to a character I created. This realization is deeply aligned with Stoic thinking. As Marcus Aurelius observed, "You live a life of false appearances. You will never achieve the happiness you intend." When we create a persona to manipulate others' emotions, we also distance ourselves from the possibility of being truly known and loved. Let's examine the neurological impact of these two approaches. Relationships based on manipulation and obsession primarily activate dopamine circuits in the brain, the same associated with addictions. These circuits provide intense, but momentary, pleasure, requiring ever-increasing doses of the stimulus to maintain the same level of response. This is why manipulative relationships tend to escalate dramatically over time. The same tactic that worked before needs to be intensified to achieve the same effect. In contrast, relationships based on authenticity and real connection activate not only dopamine circuits but also serotonin and oxytocin systems. These neurotransmitters are associated with feelings of well-being, security, and lasting bonds. Instead of dramatic spikes followed by deep falls, They create a sustained sense of satisfaction and contentment. A neuroimaging study compared the brains of people in different types of romantic relationships. Those in relationships characterized by emotional highs and lows showed brain activation patterns similar to those observed in compulsive gamblers. Those in stable and secure relationships exhibited activation patterns associated with greater psychological well-being and emotional resilience. Stoic philosophy offers us a valuable perspective on this issue. For the Stoics, virtue, defined as living according to nature and reason, is the only true good. Applied to relationships, this means that how you relate is more important than the specific outcomes you achieve. Manipulating someone to gain obsession is distorting the nature of human relationships, which should be based on mutual choice and respect. As Epictetus taught, remember that you are an actor in a play, short or long, where the author wants you to perform. In relationships, we can choose to play the role of the manipulator, seeking control and validation, or the role of an authentic human being, seeking genuine connection and mutual growth. Obsession, when deeply analyzed, reveals itself as a distorted form of connection. The obsessed person is not truly seeing and appreciating the other in their entirety, but projecting fantasies, fears, and unmet needs. Similarly, those who seek to create obsession in others are often trying to fill an internal void through external validation and control. This is precisely the type of attachment Stoicism teaches us to avoid. As Seneca wrote, "It is better to conquer our own hearts than to conquer cities." The true conquest is not in creating emotional dependency in others, but in developing mastery over our own needs for validation and control. So, how can we apply these principles in practice? How can we spark genuine interest without resorting to manipulation? First, develop authenticity. This means knowing your own values, limitations, and qualities, and expressing them consistently. Authenticity builds trust, and trust is the foundation of any meaningful connection. Second, cultivate presence. When you're with someone, be truly present, actively listening, responding genuinely, observing without judgment. Mindful presence is increasingly rare in our distracted world, making it an incredibly magnetic quality. Third, practice selective vulnerability. Sharing fears, hopes, and personal experiences creates real intimacy. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the clearest demonstration of courage and authenticity. Fourth, maintain consistency between words and actions. As Stoicism teaches, your character is revealed not by what you say, but by what you do consistently. This congruence inspires lasting trust and respect. Fifth, live a life with purpose independent of relationships. Paradoxically, the less you need a relationship to feel complete, the more attractive you become as a partner. People with a clear purpose naturally attract those who resonate with their values and direction. A client implemented these principles after years of manipulative relationships. Initially, he was skeptical, accustomed to quick results through calculated techniques. He feared that authenticity would make him boring or too available. What he discovered was precisely the opposite. For the first time, women are interested in me, not in the performance I put on, he reported. It's a completely different feeling, less dramatic initially, but infinitely more satisfying over time. Studies in relationship psychology confirm this experience. Relationships based on authenticity may take longer to develop emotional intensity, but tend to create deeper and more resilient connections over time. It's the difference between building on rock or on sand. Stoicism teaches us that true tranquility comes not from controlling the external world, but from aligning our expectations and actions with the nature of things. In relationships, this means accepting that we cannot control how others feel, only how we present ourselves to the world. When we focus on being authentic, consistent, and present, we free both the other person and ourselves from the toxic cycle of emotional manipulation. As Marcus Aurelius observed, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Similarly, the quality of your relationships depends on the purity of your intentions and the authenticity of your actions. This is the true lesson Stoicism offers about relationships. Do not seek to create obsession. Seek to create connection. Do not try to manipulate emotions. Cultivate virtue and presence. Do not see the other as an object to be conquered, but as a complex human being to be discovered and appreciated. In the end, manipulation techniques may give you moments of validation and control, but only authenticity can offer you the experience of being truly known and loved. Remember, the goal is not to make a woman obsess over you. The goal is to become someone worth falling in love with, not for your strategies or techniques, but for the substance of your character and the authenticity of your presence. And this, perhaps, is the deepest lesson Stoicism has to offer about love and relationships. The path to genuine connection begins not with strategies to manipulate the other, but with the continual commitment to cultivate the best of yourself. In the end, it is not emotional games that sustain meaningful relationships, but the willingness to show yourself as you truly are and to see the other in their entirety. As Seneca wisely observed, the greatest goods are produced with work and care. There are no shortcuts to authentic and lasting connections. The next time you feel the temptation to resort to emotional manipulation to create interest, remember, obsession may seem like love, but it is only its distorted shadow. Real love flourishes in the light of authenticity, not in the shadows of manipulation. Cultivate virtue, practice authenticity, and allow the connections in your life to develop naturally, based not on strategies or techniques, but on true mutual appreciation. This is the wisdom Stoicism offers us, not just for romantic relationships, but for all human connections that give meaning and depth to our existence. See your relationships as opportunities, not for control or validation, but for growth and authentic expression. In this shift of perspective lies true Stoic wisdom and the path to connections that not only satisfy momentarily but truly enrich your life.